Welcome back to my channel, guys. This is going to be a follow-up to my last video. If you haven't seen part one of this video, I highly suggest you guys go check it out. The link will be available in the description of this video. So this is going to be part two, following up how going to Russia had changed me, what my plans are in the future. Kind of want to brush up and let you guys know where my head is at these days, what my wife and I are both planning to do. But before I do that, I want to welcome everybody to my channel. Once again, my name is Edward. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you're a new subscriber, thank you guys for subscribing. Please be sure to rate the video, leave a like, leave a comment in the comment section, and let me know what you guys thought. Share your views, opinions, experiences. I'd love to hear from you guys. I also would like to address any of my Russian subscribers that may be watching. Здравствуйте, меня зовут Эдвард. Если вы только подключаетесь в мой канал, добро пожаловать. Благодарю вас за подписку. Также ставьте лайки или дизлайк, если вам нравится этот ролик. Если вам интересно посмотреть это видео с субтитрами, также с переводчиком, пожалуйста, включайте это видео через Яндекс браузер. Едем дальше. Ultimately, I just want to tell you guys why I decided to film this type of content in the first place, and let you guys know why I am uploading these types of videos. So initially, before I follow up on part one of why I decided to go to Russia in the first place and how it has changed me and what my plans are for the future, I'd like to let you guys know why I'm filming these videos and why I decided to upload them. I want to kind of rewind a little bit. 7 years before we moved to Florida from New York City, and I want to kind of tell you guys why we moved here in the first place. So I grew up, as I told you guys in my last video, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I met my wife. And the reason that we ended up moving down to Florida is because after living in New York City most of my life, from childhood into my adulthood, once my wife was pregnant, we both decided that ultimately we didn't think that New York City was going to be a very good place for us to raise our daughter. There were a lot of different factors and reasons for that. One of those reasons was, I don't want to get too much into politics, but generally we saw that the city was not headed into a good place. A lot of their policies, economics, and things of that nature were not headed into the right direction, in my opinion, as well as some of the things that are being taught in their public school system. My wife and I disagree with. We both share more conservative type of views, and we would like to be a little bit more hands-on with our daughter's education instead of the government kind of telling us what they can and cannot teach our child. So we didn't see a future in New York, as well as the fact that the cost of living was skyrocketing. It was just very expensive. So we ended up leaving in 2017, kind of picking a place on the map, and ended up moving down south to Florida. So why Russia? Up until after spending about 7 years in Florida, we noticed that some of the reasons as to why we left New York, we thought it would be better down south, and it is in a lot of ways. As you guys know, there are a lot of pros and cons to any type of a move. There are things that you have to sacrifice, as well as things that you may gain from relocating. And for us, what we gained was the fact that we became homeowners, living in a nice, quiet suburban neighborhood. But at the same time, we noticed as time went on, as the years began to go on, it feels like we grew more and more isolated. There's certain things about living in a city that are just not possible here. For example, you can't just most times walk down to the grocery store or to your corner market or what have you. You have to drive everywhere. And so along with that comes a lot of, you could say, isolation. You don't see people as much. People are very, very busy working. Some people are working 2 or 3 jobs just to pay the bills and just to survive. Of course, things have changed a lot in America. It's expensive to live just about anywhere you go. Florida as well. Florida has grown tremendously. The township where I live at, there's always constant development, constant building, constant road work, constant growth. A lot of people are moving here as well as a lot of people moving out. Florida is a very transitional state. So up until, I reunited and reconnected with my dad in Russia after basically 35 years of my life, I had never really had any thoughts about visiting Russia in the first place. And once I got there, it seems like after my first trip and then the second, I just could not stop thinking about it. And so leading into our second trip, I remember our second time around, we went there very shortly after we got back home to the United States from our first. So I ended up getting back and we began to plan our second trip. As I mentioned, I wanted my wife and my daughter to meet my side of the family in Moscow. And so as soon as I got back home, back to the States, I decided that we were going to get all of our documents in order so that my daughter can get her Russian citizenship that she was eligible for by birth, for the fact that I had retained mine. And we also applied for a visa for my wife. And so we went back to Russia just in time for New Year's in 2021. We got there in December of 2021 and stayed there till about February, right before the whole special military operation had begun. Of course, at that time, we weren't thinking about, any of these things. We didn't even know that there were certain plans in action for that to occur. We were just very excited about meeting my family, introducing my wife and my daughter to my father, having them meet, and experiencing Russia, especially Moscow. So as I mentioned in my first video, the first time I had flown there, it was springtime going into summer. So the weather was very nice. There was a lot to do. It was a lot easier to get around and get things done. Second time around, we went there in the winter, right in the middle of the winter. And it was, for us, living in Florida, we're very acclimated here. So of course we've been here for a while, for a few years. And so, our blood had thinned out. So we weren't very used to the cold, even though we experienced pretty harsh winters up north in New York as well. So we get to Russia the second time around, long flight, just like the first, but we made it through, got to Moscow, ended up going to my father's house, and I introduced basically my side of the family to the other side of the family. People were preparing for Russian New Year, which is a very big deal in Russia. And so we ended up spending that time with my dad, my cousins, aunts, uncles, and having a really good time. There were times where we hadn't experienced these types of level of closeness here in many, many years. The holidays went great. There were fireworks. We spent a lot of time walking around the center of Moscow, looking at all the lights. We visited Gum Mall. It was very cold, so there wasn't as much that we could do. But ultimately, my wife fell in love with Russia. She fell in love with Moscow. We both fell in love with the people. We both fell in love with the culture there. And, by definition, as a Russian, you would say that I should know the culture very well. But I felt very disconnected from it because I grew up here. But after my wife and I got back to America, the first thing that we felt, we had to take a flight from Moscow to New York, from New York to Florida. And when we had landed in New York, after spending 3 months in Russia, this overall feeling of gloom just set in, because we noticed just how different the people were. Once we landed in New York, if any of you guys know LaGuardia or JFK, those airports are not exactly up to standard, especially compared to a lot of international airports. And so once we arrived in New York, we landed in JFK. Our connecting flight was a very small window to catch that flight. It was about a 30-minute time window in order for us to do the layover. And so we scrambled to get all of our checked luggage in order and pick that up. And I remember just seeing once again, the people and how frantic everybody was and how anxious everybody was. And people were so filled with anxiety and the rush to get to wherever they were going. we just felt this presence, this difference in culture. One of the things we liked about Russia was just how warm everybody was. You know, Russians have this reputation of having this cold exterior. But the one thing that I learned for myself, especially the fact that I am a Russian and that I was born there, was that we do come off as standoffish people, but once you get to know us, we are the type of people to give you the shirt off of our back. And that's exactly what we experienced there. You know, while we were in Russia, the second time around, my dad, who owns a couple of apartments, ended up giving us one of his apartments to stay in for the duration. And very shortly, the first week, we had an incident where the pipes in the apartment upstairs from us had burst. And so it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. We were all asleep, and I heard this dripping sound. And so it woke me up. I got out of bed, and as soon as my feet touched the floor, they were wet. And so I jumped out of bed, and I started looking at what was going on. Where was this water coming from? And I go into the hallway of my father's apartment, and I see that water is just coming down like a downpour from the ceiling. So this was literally, you know, like Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And that's actually exactly what happened. And so I remember calling my dad, and at the time I thought this was just like completely insane. I said, look, Dad, the apartment is flooding. You know, what the hell do we do? You know, we have all our stuff here. It's all getting wet. We have our daughter there, who's at the time 4 years old. And he's like, listen, you got to stay at the apartment and man the fort, you know, get the water out, call somebody to come and repair the situation. And so I remember going downstairs to the lobby and looking for a phone number where I can call to get help. And I ended up finding the building's plumber, and they came very quickly. They shut the water off to the entire building to try to stop the flow of water. And during that time, as my wife and I are scrambling to try to get some of this water out and to try to stop, you know, the water from coming in, our neighbors, we were basically living in this big building in this old Soviet-like building, and our neighbors were coming up to our door in the apartment that we were staying, and who was bringing us towels and who was bringing us buckets. And, you know, people were very curious about us. They were asking us where we were from. Of course, once I started speaking to them in Russian, they were very interested about our story and what we were doing there. And so, but people were very helpful. And to touch on the difference between here and the US, or maybe this has been our personal experience, but, you know, after we had moved to Florida, a couple of years later, we had an incident where the air conditioning unit in our garage in our house had ended up caught on fire, and it was billowing all this smoke. And I remember coming outside after the fire department was called, and I remember seeing my neighbors. Some of my neighbors gathered around our home, some of them which we didn't really know or talk to very much, didn't really know on a personal level, but a lot of them were just standing there with their phones and filming the whole thing. Nobody once came up to us to ask us if we were okay and offer us any type of a help. I remember the fire department came and they quickly got the situation under control and resolved. But this was one of the highlights. This is one of the significant differences, because when this incident happened in Russia, when the pipes had burst, all of the neighbors from the building were coming downstairs to check in on us, offering us towels, offering to help. So it was really touching. I really felt how generous the Russian people were. And I know that, you know, people there financially don't make as much money as they do here in America, but what they do offer is this warm-hearted generosity, this feeling of community, this feeling of togetherness, which I really did not experience here. You know, living in the United States, we are brought up and we teach our children to be very individualistic, to be an individual. And I'm not sure how it is in other places, but I didn't get that vibe in Russia. I felt like there was a huge sense of community, of togetherness, and that was very evident through the actions of the people that we had met. And it seemed like everybody that I had spoken to, whether from your random taxi driver to the security guard at the mall when I was asking for directions on how to get to a specific place, people were very willing to help, as well as people that I was introduced through my family. So after this whole incident happened in my dad's apartment, and after the pipes had burst, my cousin Irina ended up contacting one of her best friends, her childhood friends from school, who at the time was renting an apartment right in the center of Moscow. And so it just happened that the tenants that were renting from her were actually leaving. And so that apartment became open and available, and she offered us this apartment, which was literally walking distance from the Red Square. She offered us this apartment to stay in for the duration of our time there. And so we were very glad to take her up on her offer. And so we stayed there, which in retrospect turned out to be an amazing thing, because we were right in the heart of everything. And even though it was winter, we were staying right near this very famous part of Moscow, in the center, called Arbat Street. And so my wife and I would take these like evening walks in the parks and in the surrounding areas there. And it was quite an amazing thing, because no matter where we went, there were constantly people everywhere. There were constantly places where we can go and explore, restaurants that we could sit down and eat at. And in comparison, due to the exchange rate, things were very, very cheap. The dollar holds a lot of weight in Russia. I understand now that there are sanctions, and there are a lot of difficulties in moving your money over there, which is one of the issues that we're having when it comes to consideration of living in Russia, and that's exactly what we've been thinking about. So ever since we got back, my wife and I, as often as we could, after we put our daughter to bed at night, we sit down and we turn on YouTube, and we try to learn everything we can about Russia. We watch a lot of videos from a lot of different YouTubers, a lot of expats who have moved to Russia from different places, different parts of the world, whether it's from America or whether it's from other countries. There are a couple of very good channels that we subscribe to. One of them is a buddy of mine named Dan, and his channel is called Wild Siberia. He's also a United States military veteran. He served in the Marine Corps and ended up moving to Siberia, of all places, to try to find his inner peace. And so I wish him well. He's doing very great, and I'm really, really happy for him. So if you're watching this, Dan, I just want to say hello to you and Ksenia. And I know you're back in the States right now, but I know you're probably eager to get back into Russia. And so, we've been back now for 2 years. We've been living in the United States ever since we got home. And, the more time goes on, the more and more we can't stop thinking about returning there. And my wife and I ultimately started to consider moving there. And so right now we're at a point where we're about 95% sure that we would like to try living in Russia. We would like to try moving to Moscow. So as homeowners that we are, we are right now working on the logistics of trying to make that move. And so we've been getting our house ready. We've been doing minor renovations and repairs around our home to try to prepare the house. And with everything that's going on with this economy, with the inflation and skyrocketing interest rates, we were thinking about selling the property, but we also know that it's not wise to burn our bridges. So now we're debating renting out the house and traveling down to Russia, to Moscow, for a period of a year and trying it out. And so I've been seeking a lot of advice from people that we know, people who are Russian speakers, Russian people who have moved down to the United States. And I've been hearing a lot of contrasting stories, but from everything I see from people who are there now, who are living there, especially from the expat community, they seem to be loving it. They seem to be loving their cost of living in relationship to their cost of living in the United States. Things here are very, very expensive across the board, no matter where you live, no matter what state you're in, no matter where you go. And the pressure, this burden of responsibility to have multiple jobs, this culture that we have here of this grind, this grinding and just never having enough time for anything. We have many people, acquaintances and friends that we know who really hardly see their children because, they're constantly, mom and dad are constantly working, mom and dad are constantly stressed. My daughter, who's in first grade now, tells us all the time that she has classmates who, when school is done, I'm usually picking her up, but a lot of her friends aren't going home. because their parents are simply unable to pick them up. Their parents are at work, they work long hours, and I have nothing against that. I understand, we've done the same thing here. But, after a while, feeling and living this way, you start to feel like you're not really living. You start to feel like you're just existing, and you're constantly trying to keep your head above water. And, there are other factors like, while I do believe America has a culture, it's just not the culture that seems to be the most exciting to me. It doesn't seem, especially, the township where we live there, it's a beautiful place down here in Florida. It's a lot safer in comparison to where we were living before in New York City. But at the same time, it seems like there's just not a whole lot to do. How many times can you go to the same museum without getting bored? And in Russia, when we were in Moscow, there were so many things to do that Moscow is so big that it's absolutely impossible to explore it all. And we were there for 3 months, and we could hardly get to even a fraction of what's available. I mean, if you like culture, if you like museums, there's 1,000,001 different kinds of museums for everything that you might be into. If you like parks, there are beautiful parks everywhere. The streets are well maintained, they're well kept, they're cleaned. They even have these special trucks that these street sweepers that essentially drive down the highways and the roads in Moscow, and they clean the roads, they spray them down with water. Everything was very efficient there. Delivery services I found to be more efficient than here in the United States. So they have things like Uber Eats, similar versions of it from different companies. But we found that whenever we had ordered food, it would be at our door within 10 to 15 minutes, literally. Tips, their tipping culture is very different. Most of the times, tips are not included. We were not, obligated to tip, even though we did anyway. We felt like because we grew up here, we're used to the service industry and how it works. We would often be very generous, and it was the same way for us there. We would always leave a tip. But I remember certain relatives of mine looking at us funny whenever we decided to leave a tip, because they would say, well, it's not really necessary because these delivery couriers are actually paid, sufficiently for their work. So that was another thing we noticed. When it came to public transportation, their public transportation system in Moscow is amazing. I mean, every single train station there is clean and it's safe, and the trains come almost every 30 seconds. It's so reliable. But most of all, each station is like a work of art. Each station is like a museum. There's these huge murals on the ceilings and statues everywhere. And the other thing that we really loved is the fact that there are these monuments. And so when we were in Russia, we noticed a lot of remnants of old monuments that had, communist symbols on them. And a lot of people may say, well, no, Russia is still communist, but it's not. It's the difference is that they don't erase their history, such as what's going on here. America, for many different reasons, is starting to take down a lot of monuments. This has been going on here for a long time because some of these things, historically are offensive to some groups of people. And while I understand that side of the argument, I don't really agree, because at the same time, this is part of our history, and you can't just erase history. You can't just, take down a monument and, or wipe a textbook clean and pretend that it didn't exist. It's still part of our history, and I believe that it should be preserved. And so what we loved about Moscow specifically was the fact that they had preserved their history. There's a lot of these old buildings, this amazing architecture. Things are built differently, and it's preserved. They're all about maintaining and preserving the facades of certain buildings because they don't want to take it down because it's historically significant. And so other things that we experienced there was, my daughter, during the time we were there, we had placed her into this daycare, this Russian daycare, because, we wanted to have her be able to play with other children and essentially, dive in and integrate with the local population. And, we definitely thought it would be a challenge for her, as my daughter is not a Russian speaking child, because I stupidly did not begin teaching her Russian when she was born. I'll touch on that in another time. But, she began to integrate very quickly, and the cost of daycare was significantly cheaper than it is in the United States. So, for example, we were paying for this private daycare through my cousin, which she had hooked us up with, we were paying about $50 or $60 per week for full-time daycare, which in comparison, we had our daughter in daycare here in pre-K before she had started public school, and we were paying a lot more money than that. You guys can imagine. And if you have more than one child here, I really don't know how some people do it. I mean, we know that there are people who are literally working just so they can afford to keep their children in daycare, which to me doesn't make any sense. And over there, we were able to do it for next to nothing. Of course, they also had public free daycares available, which also were amazing, and there was nothing wrong with those either. The kids are provided with very healthy meals. They're not eating junk food. They're not eating chips and all this stuff. There was a lot of like home-cooked, homemade, healthy food. Another thing that I noticed interestingly was that here, when we had our daughter in daycare, there were certain food menu items that we couldn't send her to school with because there were other kids that may have been allergic to nuts and all sorts of allergies, and that was just not a thing in Russia. Whenever we brought her up, they were completely fine with it. If we wanted to send our kid to school with a big old bag of peanuts, we were welcome to do so. There was no reason why, because somebody else's child is affected by some sort of allergy, that our child would not be able to consume those things. In a sense, it feels like a lot of things here are almost dumbed down. It's almost as if they think our kids are stupid and unwilling or unable to learn anything, which is strange to me. And this is evident in how they teach our kids, in the stuff that goes on in school, in the programming and brainwashing that occurs. For example, my daughter in first grade, like every other child, if you have young kids in schools here, is learning mathematics. And if you guys are familiar with what they're teaching, is that it's all done through Common Core math. And Common Core is basically meant to take something that's simple already, and in an effort to make it simpler, they've just made it more complicated. So whenever my daughter comes home from school with math homework, my wife basically ends up reteaching her the material in the way that she learned it, to make it even easier to understand. And not only so that it's easier for my child to understand, but then it becomes easier for my wife to be able to understand and teach her, because I just don't understand what's happening in this country. It feels like our population is generally being dumbed down in so many different ways. Our food here is all GMOs, and it's all chemicals and processed. And if you want to buy healthy food, you have to go for organic, which most of the time, is not even organic. They put a sticker on something and call it organic, and 9 out of 10 times you go and you find out that it really isn't. And so it just feels like America has become, I don't recognize this country anymore. America to me has become nothing but a business designed to sell you everything. And when we were in Russia, we didn't feel that way. It was very safe in Russia. We noticed a lot of the time, even while we were there, late at night, 12 o'clock, midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, sometimes we would see children, because it was close to the holidays. We would see children go downstairs, and there were playgrounds basically at the steps away from the foot of each building, and kids could be outside playing. And it was as if it was America 20 or 30 years ago, where you would see the parents upstairs in the apartment. They could peek out the window and see their children outside, as little as young as 4, 5, 6 years old, outside playing, unsupervised, unattended. And the thought of them being kidnapped is not even a thing. And this was mind-boggling to us. It's funny, because when we got back to the United States, we were talking to our 6-year-old daughter, who's very, very intelligent for her age, very mature. And we were telling her how we're thinking about moving to Russia, and how we wanted to see what her reaction would be when we told her that she could go downstairs, she could go outside unattended and play at a playground with her friends without us having to be immediately right there. And so she was like, "What do you mean, Mommy and Daddy, I'm going to get kidnapped?" And we had to reassure her that that's not really the case, that it's a very different society and it's a lot safer. We also noticed that a lot of the parents there, especially the mothers, weren't helicoptering their children. They were fully for them, going out and playing and jumping off of things and climbing things. And they weren't right on top of them within a foot away like we see here all the time. Whenever I take my kid to the playground, either the adults, the parents are sitting on the sidelines, their faces stuck into their phones like zombies, or they won't allow their kid to go more than 2 feet away from them. And I understand our reality here. I understand what it takes to live here. I understand that things here are not like they used to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where, you know, we do have to have these things in consideration whenever we're out and about in public with our children. You know, our children are our most precious commodity. They're our most precious resource, and we have to take care of them. But you know what, guys? After a while of living this way, it gets tiring. I almost feel like because of how we grew up here, because of how we had to live and adapt and survive, it's almost like when you go to another country, it's almost like you keep your head on a swivel, and it's as if you have PTSD. It's as if you're traumatized from having been brought up in the United States. And so when you get to another country where things are a little bit different and a little bit more relaxed, and the worries aren't the same, and there aren't all these mass shootings and school shootings, you know, that's another one of those things where every time I drop my daughter off at school here, every time she leaves my vehicle and I send her off to class, my first immediate thought that comes to my mind is, am I ever going to see my child again? And you know, so far, statistically, from what I understand, there have been more mass shootings in this country than there were days of the year. Imagine that, more mass shootings combined than there were days of the year, and we're only in November. And so, you know, knowing all of this information, knowing all of this, I can't help but feel that, you know, it is my opinion, of course, and you may disagree, and that would be fine. You know, share your thoughts down in the comments. But I almost feel like America has no future. You know, we're waging war after war after war. Our leaders are gaslighting people and telling everybody that everything is okay. Meanwhile, our border is basically not secure. It's essentially wide open. They're letting God knows who into this country. And if you've lived here during the attacks on 9/11 like we did, we were in New York at the time and saw this happen. I was still in high school. I saw this happen with my own eyes and joined the military, joined the army shortly afterwards. If you lived here through that time, you remember how we all came together as a nation. And I remember that it used to be like that in times of crisis, in times of national tragedy. And today it just seems like, you know, our politics, our leaders, our government, our authorities are essentially just telling us, you know, Americans are the least of our problems. We need to focus over here so that we don't focus on what's going on here. And, you know, it's just mind-boggling to me how people are living today, how middle-class people are basically struggling to make ends meet, how our senior citizens oftentimes have to choose between, you know, medicine, fuel, or food, and are struggling to make ends meet, especially if they're living on a fixed income with a disability check. And if you think that you're going to be able to get by here on a Social Security check, you know, or the fact that our generation as a whole could even look forward to that and think that we somehow could retire, it's not feasible. It's not feasible. It's crazy how my wife, who's a nurse, she's in the healthcare field, you know, has no retirement. She doesn't have any benefits through her job, knowing essentially that if we live here, if we continue to live here, she's not going to have a retirement. She's not going to have Social Security. She's not going to have all these social government programs that are available to some people now, which are basically being stripped slowly but surely. And you know, our nation is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, and yet they can print money at the push of a button on a whim. And you know, case in point, what happened to the local residents of Hawaii? You know, they got $700 per family when these people essentially lost everything. Their communities and their children all but burned to a crisp, and they got $700. Meanwhile, our leaders are deciding to print off money and hundreds of billions of dollars and send it to foreign aid and to fund other people's wars. It just makes no sense. And it just makes me think that there is a political agenda for all of this to happen. And it's not that I think it, I believe it. This is all done by design. And it makes me sad because at the end of the day, the country that I once grew up in, the country that I once was so proud to be in, is a country I no longer recognize. And I feel like, you know, when you're a person who is concerned about the future, you need to go where you're treated best. You need to go where your dollar stretches further. And in our case, we've considered many other places, but because of the fact that I have roots in Russia, because I was born there, because I have family and relatives there, because the cost of living in comparison to here is so much cheaper. I mean, we were going grocery shopping and buying organic, fresh, GMO-free groceries for our family of 3 for $30 a week. We were eating caviar and delicious vegetables and healthy, literally the food was coming from the ground to the shelf. And here everything is sprayed down with pesticides and God knows what, and injected with all kinds of poison. I mean, every time we go shopping here, even just to buy bread, you have to look at the ingredients, and the ingredient list is like a mile long. And when we bought, for example, bread in Russia, it was made out of 3 ingredients, and that's exactly how it should be. And we didn't have to pay, an arm and a leg, $5 for a loaf of bread, $5-6 for, essentially bread that doesn't have 50 million ingredients in it. And we, over there it would cost us 50 cents. A gallon of milk would cost us next to nothing. It would be less than $1. 2 pounds of potatoes would cost 75 cents and things of that nature. So when you start comparing, when you start seeing how people are living, and sure, people in Russia, make less money, but it seemed to me that everybody that I met who didn't make a lot of money was somehow richer in family, richer in spirit. I was able to have a conversation with just about everybody and anybody about anything, and there was no having to watch what I say. People weren't getting offended. People could speak on any subject and not get triggered and not get sensitive. And I can't count the amount of times, countless times where, we would meet, my wife and I would both meet people here, whether at my daughter's playground or whether through school, that really, would smile in your face and the whole hi, how are you stuff. And when nobody really cares, you could be really struggling. And if you start to try to pour your heart out and open up to people, they just don't want to hear it. And that's the unfortunate part of our culture that I no longer want to participate in. I'd rather be myself the way I am. I'm a realist and call it as I see it than have to censor myself based on what somebody else may or may not find offensive. And so we wanted to go ahead and try to move to Moscow and live there. And one of the things that I would like to do is I would like to document this experience. I would like to document my journey of how we're living here in America and our transition to Russia. And we're not 100% on this yet, because essentially where we live, we have essentially everything that we need. We have a beautiful home. Our kid goes to a great school, a great public school, which is close by. My wife works right next to home, 10-minute drive, and it's very convenient, and it's very clean, and it's very safe. And the people are also very nice, but at the grand scheme of things, we don't feel alive, and there's not a whole lot to do. And it just seems like America, no matter where you go, no matter where you fly to, is a land full of Walmart parking lots and empty shopping centers, and it's just changed so much. And I understand that with every few years, with every passing generation, things change, but it just seems here that with our nation so divided, red versus blue, black versus white, all of these groups and radicals that are forming up here, it just feels like I don't want to participate in this anymore. And it makes me truly concerned about the future of our children. And when I go to Russia and when I see how their kids live there and how articulate they are and how mature they are, especially, even the younger children, and how structured their education program is, I really like what I see. I like how childcare is either free or low cost. I like how, people have this idea, this notion that social healthcare, and I'm not a socialist, so, please don't misconstrue my words, but I like how, we had an incident where my cousin's son got injured at a daycare and we had to take him to the doctor. And, I was told here my whole life that social medicine is terrible and that the wait times are long and that, it's really not a good system. But I remember we picked him up from the daycare and we drove him to a doctor's office, which was literally a few minutes away. And we came in and we hung up our coats and we went to the second floor, and within seconds, within a matter of minutes, there were no forms that were asked. They didn't ask us for insurance. There was a doctor and a nurse who took her child, sat him down, and began to stitch him up and take care of everything. And we were in and out of the place within 10 to 15 minutes without paying a single cent. And it was that efficient, and we liked it. We also got sick with COVID while we were in Russia. And I remember we had the ability to have a doctor come to our house for like $75. If you want to go to the dentist, you can get the same day appointment, and you could either pay cash or you can go to a free version. There's a lot of English-speaking doctors, and there's a lot of Russian-speaking doctors, naturally. The cost for the services was really cheap. If you needed to get a tooth replaced or filled, it was less than $100. To get a dental cleaning, it was like $50 to $70. In a very high-tech, modern dental office that had everything and more of what we have here. I know here, as a veteran, for me to be seen by the VA, for me to get treatment of any kind, for me to go to a dentist, I have to wait 1 year in this country to be seen by a VA dentist. Meanwhile, in Russia, I could do it the same day and either pay nothing or go to a private dentist who speaks English and pay very little. The cost of an MRI over there was like less than $100. Meanwhile, you guys know, if you don't have insurance and you've ever had to get any of those things done here, they can cost upwards of thousands and thousands of dollars. My daughter, when she was 4 years old, she had an undiagnosed PDA. Her pediatrician completely dropped the ball and missed it. And by the time, we ended up having to get surgery, we got the bill. Thank God we had insurance at the time. But we still had to pay a very high deductible of thousands of dollars. We got the bill at the end of the surgery, and we realized that if we had not had insurance and we had to get the surgery, it would have completely bankrupt us, because it cost over $250,000. Meanwhile, in Russia, it would have been covered and it would have been done just as well as here. This is where my head is at now. One of the interesting things in life is that when you have the ability to compare things, it's a beautiful thing, because it allows you to have options. And I believe that everything happens for a reason. I believe that my dad came into my life for a reason. I believe that, me discovering Russia and falling so in love with it and not being able to stop thinking about it for ever since we got back, I believe like my heart is pulling me there. Like my soul is there, but my body is just physically present here. And you know what? When I was in Russia, when I was in Moscow, when I woke up and stepped outside to breathe the fresh air, I felt like this was mine. I felt like I was home. I felt like I belonged. While I understand why that the grass is not always greener, and we don't expect things to be perfect, and we expect to be met with other types of challenges that we're going to have to navigate if we decide to go ahead and go through with this move. And so I wanted to share this video with you and share my, open up my journey so that you guys can come along and become a part of it and see. And, we don't know when, we don't have a date yet. And I wanted to thank you guys for watching. To my Russian viewers, пожалуйста, я благодарю вас за то, что вы просмотрели мой ролик. Приглашаю вам подписаться. И опять же, если вам было интересно посмотреть мою историю, и вы бы хотели посмотреть с переводчиком на русском и также с субтитрами, пожалуйста, посмотрите или пересмотрите этот ролик через Яндекс браузер. And for all of my American viewers who are watching this video, maybe some of you are also considering moving overseas, and it doesn't have to be Russia. There are a lot of great places where you can go, where you could be treated well or treated better. And we do understand that politics are politics everywhere. There is no one place that is perfect and ideal for anyone. But at the same time, if you're tired of the grind, if you're tired of this mentality of hurry up and go and being silenced and not being able to have your voice heard unless it goes with the narrative of the current status quo, you should consider other places. This is not the end-all be-all. We all love this country, we love America, and we love the opportunities that it has given us all. But at the same token, there are other places where you can go because you have one life and life is short. And with that being said, guys, I thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you for tuning in. Please share your thoughts in the comments down below. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, as I plan on making more content of this nature. And once we do get to Russia, whether it's to visit or we end up moving there, I plan to share and document my journey for you guys to see it as well. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys. Take care. До свидания.